Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. Hope everybody's full and happy and ready for the afternoon session here. I'm really pleased to be here. It's an honor to be speaking to all of you here today. And I wanted to share a little bit of the experience that we have in the United States, really North America, but in the United States in particular, on setting up an emission control area for our country of United States and Canada, and most recently some of the Pacific Caribbean island territories as well. So I wanted to provide a very, very brief overview of the two main driver air pollutants in the United States that really drive the policies that we put forward, because they are the ones that have the greatest impact on human health. There are others, however, these are the big drivers, and so I wanted to provide just a quick overview of the two air pollutants that we focus on heavily and that we get at with our North American ECA. And then, of course, why we do what we do, a little bit of background on that, protecting human health and the environment, and then I'll go into the approaches that we've used in the United States, including the ECA, but a little bit of background on some of the other measures that have been taken, including some domestic engine and fuel regulations that have been put forward over the years, as well as public-private partnerships, one of which I run in order to engage industry, regulators, academia, and other partners to enhance emission reductions in all sectors, including the port and marine vessel sector, and some of the incentives that can go along with those programs to help advance some of the technologies. Okay, sorry for the cartoons, but sometimes they're easier to use. So ozone, that's one of the big pollutants that we're very concerned with. Of course, many of you may know ozone is not a direct emission from engines, from diesel engines, from ships, but it is the formation, it's a byproduct of NOx particularly, and volatile organic compounds. The big driver in the US is the nitrogen oxides, or NOx emission reductions. And so when you get the sources from factories, from cars, trucks, ships, and other combustion sources coming together with sunlight, you get the formation of ozone. And the important thing here is we often hear about, ozone. It's very good when it's up in our atmosphere, way up high where we're not exposed to it. But when it's actually formed at the ground level, it has very harmful impacts on human health. It's very reactive, damages tissue, leads to cardiopulmonary issues. They're listed here. I won't read them for you. And they also can lead to premature mortality. That's one of the main concerns we have, as well as the costs associated with going to hospital emergency rooms and doctor's appointments, and of course missing work and missing school for children. The other pollutant, very quickly, is the PM2.5. That's the big health driver. That's most of that, some of that is the primary pollutant. Primary meaning it's a direct release from exhaust. Most of it in the United States is a secondary formation. So it's a bunch of the combustion particles coming together with moisture, with metals, with organic compounds, and they consolidate into these fine, tiny little particles. You can see there the pink or red particles. Those are the PM2.5 microns in diameter. That's the human hair diagram that shows how large a human hair is compared to these tiny little particles. And and that's a nice fine beach sand as a point of reference as well. We're very concerned with both PM2.5 and PM10. The PM2.5, however, has the ability to penetrate very deeply into the lungs. It can also penetrate into the bloodstream and cause lots of things like strokes and heart attacks and premature mortality as well. Okay, this you've already seen. Simon put this up this morning, but this is a great study. It's, I think, one of the only studies real pioneering study by Dr. Corbett and his colleagues back in 2007 that focused on that PM 2.5, those small particles, globally, and specifically from shipping emissions, and then the associated premature mortality globally with ship emissions. And you can read that for yourself. It's a significant figure globally on an annual basis of premature mortality. I'm not going to read through this, but this is a list, and I understand the presentations will be made available afterwards, so you can look at this in more detail. This is just a more fine-tuned list, if you will, of health effects from PM10, PM 2.5, and ozone, and other compounds as well. Okay, so that's the 2 Air Pollutant 101 overview. They have lots of deleterious impacts on human health and the environment as well. Back to ozone, that can affect plant life and other organisms as well. So what have we done in the United States, or what's sort of our framework for addressing air pollution in the United States? We have, under the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, we're at the federal level, so we're at sort of the national level. We also have our state counterparts at California Air Resources Board and other state air agencies, and some of the local governments as well. We can put forward and do put forward laws and regulations to limit the amount of air pollution from various sources, mobile sources, stationary sources like power plants. We also, as I mentioned at the onset, we work on a voluntary basis with partners to incentivize early adoption of technologies or above and beyond regulatory requirements. And then we do a lot on the public-private partnership front to advance our partnerships, our technologies through collaborative means as well. And at EPA, we set what we call NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and those are essentially set for the entire country. And all the states and the localities have to meet these ambient air quality standards for PM 2.5, ozone, and others I won't go into, but for those in particular. And in order to meet those, the states have to, if they're not in attainment with the standards, they have to submit plans that say, here's how we're going to come into attainment. And those can include setting their own local laws, regulations. They can, they lay out sort of a roadmap for turning engines over, for example, to cleaner engines and the like. And then I'm not going to go into the stationary sources today, but we do regulate those a bit differently. And then we also actually jointly enforce with our states too. So, and this becomes really important when I'm going to talk about the ECA, because we have had a very good relationship and agreements, actually formalized agreements between the 2 entities that are responsible for enforcing the North American ECA, and I think that will become important here for the path forward that might be happening here in this region of the world. But we do jointly enforce with other federal and state agencies. Okay, this is just, I wanted to provide this because it's sort of a roadmap, and there are actually some things missing on here. We have our, I don't know if you keep up with what's going on in the United States on heavy-duty rules, but we just released another greenhouse gas phase 2 notice of rulemaking, so this is a bit out of date now. But I really want to just demonstrate that we have had to address all sources on land, on sea, sources in the United States to meet air quality standards. And on the right hand side of your screen, your right hand side, that's what I'm going to focus on mostly here today. But what's important about this is that we have also done, what we do is we'll set standards. These are mostly engine standards and engine emission standards, but we also set fuel standards that complement those engine standards, so that when you're rolling out your new engines, you're going to have a fuel that actually works with the engine, so you can actually get the planned emission reductions from those engines. So looking at the marine sector, we've put out a variety of engine rules over the years here. These are great, but they only address our domestic ships. The US EPA has a domestic mandate, so we can only regulate engines that are operating within our own country, right? So on the, what we did is we said, okay, we're doing a lot of work on the trucks and the cars and the, great, thank you, locomotives and things like that, but we need to really get at these other big sources, which are ships. So we put a variety of rules forward that address only our domestic fleets, which is great, but it wasn't enough. Our modeling was showing that we really needed to get at those much larger engines, and most of those are not U.S. engines. Those are internationally flagged ships that are coming in and out doing business in U.S. ports. So what we had to do, and I think most of you are familiar with this process, we had to petition the International Maritime Organization for an emission control area to actually be able to have a legal mechanism to get at those ships, right? Because they're not U.S. flagships, or at least most of them aren't. So that was the impetus. The impetus of going to the IMO was we did not have enough legal authority to address those large engines, and if we were going to clean up our air and meet our air quality standards, we had to be able to get at those engine sources. So that was the high-level justification for going to the IMO. And I'll get into that in a little bit here in more detail. Many of you know it's U.S. and Canada. It's a couple of French territories off the east coast of Canada as well. In 2014, January 1, 2014, we also adopted the ECA for the Caribbean, U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico as well. It's a phased in over time. We've had now a few years of experience in implementing the ECA, and started with the 0.5% sulfur at 200 nautical miles. We're now down at 0.1% sulfur. That was just as of the first of this year. And then this coming January, in 7 months or so, we'll have the Tier 3 NOx emission standards. So the first two phases were really to get at the SOx, and now we're going to get at the NOx emissions from ships. And that will come into effect on January 1, 2016. This is, you've seen this, I think, this morning from Simon, but this is just essentially what the global standard looks like in terms of sulfur content, and then the ECA sulfur standard as well. And what's not shown on here is the Tier 2 NOx global standard is 2011, just for your information. So the global standard is currently at the Tier 2 standard, I think, retroactive to 2011, I believe. And then ours will take effect here in 2016. So these are the results of some of the modeling that we've done that show the benefits of implementing the ECA. So I think it sort of speaks for itself. This is looking specifically at PM2.5 emission reductions projecting out to 2020. And you can see clearly very large impacts along the coasts, but we were actually quite surprised that we were actually seeing impacts and benefits to the center of the country. It was traveling quite far, and I think that's something to be really cognizant of here, that when you're thinking about reducing those ship emissions, that yes, there are lots of people that live right at the ports, and that exposure is very large, but there is also an impact further inland as you're considering a regional ECA or a countrywide ECA. That's something to keep in mind, that these emissions do travel. Okay, this is for ozone, so getting at those NOx emission reductions, and then therefore the ozone reductions as well. Big impacts along the coasts, and then also inland as well. We also looked at sulfur deposition, so terrestrial and aquatic deposition of sulfur, and those that's very important for a lot of reasons. And you can see clearly lots of emissions, deposition reduction on the coast, as well as all the way into the center of the country. Anytime we do a regulation, including something through an international body, we have to do a cost-benefit analysis with any regulation we do to demonstrate that the costs are going to be hopefully a lot less than what you're going to have by way of monetized benefits. And indeed, that is the case here with the North American ECA. We did our cost estimate, and you can see for yourself here, it's about a $3.1 billion, that's not a small number, but $3.1 billion industry-wide implementation cost versus the benefits, the monetized benefits of the emissions reductions that will be achieved in this case. So it's by 2030, it's being between 110 and 280 billion. So clearly a very, very, very good investment that's going to come in the form of reduced premature mortality. It's going to come in the form of increased productivity, really, because you have fewer people that are missing work, missing school, and going to the hospital and things like that, and to the doctor for respiratory and other ailments. Okay. This is the only slide I have on the actual process that we went through to submit a application, if you will, to the IMO for an emission control area. I have a whole presentation just on this, but I was asked to at least to sort of touch on the process. And you can see here there are many, many steps that have to be taken. And I think Simon alluded to this morning to the time it does take to go through the application process, to the data collection, the emissions inventories, the health impact assessments that have to be done. You also have to we had to look at all of our current and projected regulations, and we had to demonstrate that even with all of those, we were still not going to be able to meet our health and air quality standards. So we had to demonstrate that as well. So because that was the real nugget for making the case for the emission control area. We needed that in order to meet our health and air quality standards. So there's a variety of steps. It takes, it's 4 or 5 year process. It's a long process, but it's well worth it because, as Simon was saying earlier, it brings consistency. There's an understood methodology. Industry, sort of knows what is coming and how to comply more or less, and we'll get into some of that too. So it's fairly straightforward, and hopefully, if other countries do, I know there's the European ECAs, and if other countries start to adopt more, it will really, our hope is that it will help bring the cost down, ideally, for industry and for actually complying with this, because the more engagement from other countries and more requirements, the cost of the fuel will come down ultimately. Those technologies that are needed to comply will come down in terms of cost, and the innovations that are needed to come up with those technologies will be greater. Okay, this is also very abbreviated. There are lots of ways of meeting the requirements of an ECA. For the North American ECA, obviously, to meet the sulfur emissions or the PM emission requirements, that's fuel switching to the lower sulfur fuel. So that's the main requirement that we have in the North American ECA now. There's a mechanism built in to the North American ECA for alternative methods or ways of complying with the emissions standards. And we have been entertaining some of those requests that have come in. They do come in periodically to put things like scrubbers and things like that onto ships to comply with the equivalent. So it has to show equivalency to the fuel sulfur emission standards. The SCR, the water-based technologies, the EGRs, those are mostly for the NOx, to get at the NOx emission reductions. And I think tomorrow I'll be going into more details on those technologies in particular to address nitrogen oxides. Yeah. I should also mention the In terms of complying with the sulfur, to a lesser degree with the NOx, but definitely with the sulfur emission requirements, LNG has also been an option, and there have been some examples of that happening in the United States where there have been carriers, some Total Motion Express, Trailer Express, or TOTE. It's a carrier that operates entirely within the ECA. They basically move goods to and from Alaska from the mainland, so they're always in the emission control area. So they put forward a petition for use of LNG instead of the low sulfur fuel. They thought that would be a good investment for them, given that they operate the entire time within the ECA. Okay. Really quickly, I know I'm running out of time. I wanted to bring it back to a local example. The South Coast Air Basin, most of you probably know that as Los Angeles, city of Los Angeles and the greater Los Angeles area. That is one of our most polluted air basins in the country. Also happens to be the home of our largest ports in the country, ports of LA and Long Beach. This is just to demonstrate to you the importance of ship emissions in their own inventory there in the South Coast. So the South Coast Air Quality Management District put this inventory together, showing the contribution from various sources, and you can see commercial boats and ships, off-road equipment, and heavy-duty diesel trucks. Those are the top three, and most of those are related to the movement of goods to and from the ports. So you have lots of trucks coming in, you have lots of rail activity at the rail yards. So those are all related to ports and ship emissions. And you can see where they need to be by 2032 and 2023 and where they are. It's really, really important that we knock off those top three blocks, including those ship emissions. Otherwise, they're not going to meet their air quality standards. Okay. There's a lot going on in California. We've learned a lot. I'm going to need just a couple more minutes. We've learned a lot from California, and I wanted to emphasize this because of what I heard this morning, that California has done a lot in terms of implementing their own rules and regulations that always go above and beyond what the federal standards or requirements are asking for. And so this is just a sampling of what they've done on ocean-going vessels, including hovercraft. But I wanted to point out the ocean-going vessel fuel switching rule. They've had that in place since 2009. That was before we went to the International Maritime Organization and put forward an emission control area, and we learned a lot from California's fuel mini ECA, if you will. They did their own regional ECA. We learned a lot from their efforts, and I think industry learned a lot from their efforts too, because they had to switch fuel. They had to learn how to do it. Granted, it was at 24 nautical miles, not 200 nautical miles, but still. And I believe it was a 0.1% right off the bat distillate fuel requirement. So in terms of applying what we learned from California, it's a bit synonymous or analogous to perhaps what might happen here. I think we learned a lot. It was very valuable to have them as sort of the trailblazers, really. And then we brought forward our application to the IMO based on a lot of what we did learn from them in California. They're doing a lot of other stuff here that I won't go into, including a shore power regulation. So there is a regulation in California for ships to plug in. I've heard a lot about shore power here today. So that's another option, is just regulating it instead of incentives. But the ports, I'm not going to go into these. I don't have enough time. But you'll be able to read these slides. This is just more detail on each of the California regulations. And I wanted to point out the last bullet here. We are I think probably of most interest for industry here, for the shipping industry. California is doing a regulatory review of their ECA, their fuel switching law or rule, to see if that might be phased out because of the now harmonization with the sulfur content with the North American ECA. So we're both now at the 0.1%. But there are some slight differences in what they require and what we require under the North American ECA, and they're figuring out whether or not they want to phase that out. Stay tuned any day, I think, now. I'm bugging them all the time about it. Okay, incentives. I mentioned incentives. We have incentives at the national level, state level, local level. Our ports have been incredible partners. I can't emphasize that enough. We, at the national level, have a variety of incentives that we put forward. We have technology verification programs, both at the national level and at the state of California level, to verify those technologies so that industry knows to some degree of certainty that those technologies are going to work. And then a variety of other federal programs that provide basically money to offset the cost of implementing technologies. Okay, I'm not going to go into this. This is the program that I run. We've given a fair amount of money just to the California ports alone to affect, in this case, over 500 engines and lots of emission reductions from those projects. And then California has their own sources of funding. This is just something to consider, I think, perhaps as models. I think there are perhaps some incentive programs maybe in this region that use fees or taxes to garner funds to put forward projects like grant projects and things like that that can put cleaner fuel into ships as a demonstration, filters, scrubbers, and things like that. Shore power as well. So there are lots of ways that California's been very creative in terms of setting up those incentive funds, and you can see just by some of the numbers on the slide, they're very large amounts of money and very helpful. Okay, and then the ports themselves. San Pedro Bay ports, which are the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, amazing partners. They've been real trailblazers. I think we've heard a lot about them here today. In terms of setting up their Clean Air Action Plan in 05-06 timeframe. I think as you heard from Christine Lowe this morning, that was, yes, in part an action that they wanted to take, but it was also because they received a lot of pressure from the health impact studies that were done, and actually, frankly, some lawsuits that were brought forward because of the pollution from the ports. So they started up in 05-06 timeframe, and they were the first to have really a good, solid roadmap forward for how they were going to reduce particulate matter, NOx, greenhouse gases even, from their port operations. And in order to do that, along with the regulations, they've set up their own programs, their vessel speed reduction program, for example. They have cleaner fuel programs, shore power programs that are now going away because it's a law. And hovercraft programs, clean truck programs, banning trucks that are older model years from coming in and doing business at the ports. And all of these come with some sort of incentive, like a berthing dockage fee reduction or something like that. So they've been very, very, very proactive and very engaged and very successful in terms of their emission reductions. Northwest ports of Port Metro Vancouver, Seattle, and Tacoma, something very similar. They have their own clean air strategy and incentive programs put forward to help reduce emissions from ports and vessels. And the same with New York and New Jersey. What I wanted to note here in these last three slides is that these clean air plans, strategies, incentive programs have been done with their partner ports. So they've actually worked together. So New York, New Jersey have worked together. The ports of Seattle, Tacoma, and Metro Vancouver have worked together, as well as LA and Long Beach, so that they're not putting each other at least a competitive disadvantage on the green front, on the environmental front. They are competitors in every other way, of course, but they made a conscious effort to make sure that they were all more or less on the same page on the environmental front, so that they weren't taking business away from their neighbor ports for environmental reasons. And that's it for now.